We are continuing our discussion of Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar. Um, in our first session, we talked about this wonderful Midrash, which I first read about in the Quran, which was Joseph was so handsome that Mrs. Potiphar, in trying to explain why she couldn't hold herself back from Joseph, invited Joseph to serve at a luncheon, and the ladies invited to the luncheon were peeling fruit with sharp knives, and they wound up cutting themselves. They were so taken with Joseph's beauty that I read that in the Quran when I was reading the story of Joseph in the Quran, and I said, "This is so good, it has to be a Jewish midrash," and sure enough, it was. And so we read the midrash, and then last time we continued this discussion of Potiphar and Mrs. Potiphar and Joseph, and we have really gone off I would say, the midrashic deep end of trying to explain what was going on with such things as, is there more people coming in? With such things as Potiphar was a eunuch, and because the same word for like an officer in the court and eunuch is the same in Hebrew, so the rabbis in their midrashic imagination said Potiphar was a eunuch, which explains why Mrs. Potiphar had, how shall I say this delicately, the energy to pursue alternative energy. That's one of my favorite subjects. She had alternative energy as an alternative to her husband. Sometimes I talk about sin in Judaism, and sin in Judaism, a word for sin, there was actually a lot of them, is fate, which comes from archery, and it means to miss the mark. And the way I sometimes describe it, if I don't want to be too outrageous, I will say, you were aiming at that roast beef sandwich, and you missed, you got the ham sandwich. And then if I want to get a chuckle, I say, you were aiming at your wife, and you missed, you got your neighbor's wife. Well, what could happen to anybody? Okay, so now it's time for Jerry's jaw to drop. Thank you, Jerry. So poor Mrs. Potiphar, married to a eunuch, in comes this gorgeous guy, Joseph. And then the question, the rabbis, they have time on their hands. So they ask the question, well, how is it that Potiphar is a eunuch? And they imagine, in the rabbinic midrashic imagination, that Potiphar also was taken with Joseph's beauty and had homoerotic designs on Joseph. So therefore, God sends an angel to castrate Potiphar. Other than that, this is pretty dull stuff. And
he was a eunuch already. No, he wasn't.
So that's how he became a eunuch.
Okay.
And then in step 2, he also was disfigured by, I think, either the same angel or another angel. And then there was well, there were a bunch of interesting discussions. I won't try and review them all. We actually read a lot. And let's see, I think, now I'm a little confused about where we are. Just 1 second, I will double check. Oops. Jacob's age. Okay. So there was in this article, a discussion that actually Joseph was planning this whole thing, which is how he managed to show up when there was nobody in the house. You remember the story in the Torah says that Joseph and Mrs. Potiphar were alone in the house. And I think one of you asked the question, which is a good question, that how is it that the house was empty? And again, the rabbinic midrashic imagination speculates that there was some big idol worship festival and everybody left. So that's kind of where we are in this article. And now we're going to have a very interesting discussion about Jacob's image appearing. Mm-hmm. And this is again in the same article. So I'm going to grab the article. And let's see if I can to you all again. Okay, I presume you can see the article. Jacob's image appears. Yes. Okay. Joanne, are you up to reading? We gave you a rest
Yes.
last week.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay,
Um,
good. Good to see you.
Jacob's image appears. The lascivious wife with whom Joseph does intend to lie, according to this Agadah, is juxtaposed with his father Jacob, his savior. Do ex machina, the image of the patriarch, appears to rescue his son from completing the sexual act.
Yep, my Latin is not great, but I think it's "deus ex machina." And that is a phrase, I'm sure one of you probably has a more elegant translation, but basically it's God intervening in the story to correct things going along or to move things in a different direction. So let's see what they are saying. Somebody else joining. Let's see what they're saying. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, tractate Sota. So,
And
okay, let's.
she seized him by garments, saying, "Lie with me."
So
This
that's verse
teaches
12. So that's a quote from the Torah text.
Okay. So this teaches that they both went to bed naked. At that moment, the image of his father appeared to him in the window and said, "Joseph, in the future, your brothers will have their names written on the priestly breastplate, and yours amongst them. Do you want it effaced and yourself called a shepherd of prostitutes, as it says? Um,
A man.
a man who loves wisdom will please his father, but a shepherd of prostitutes loses his wealth."
Okay,
That
so let's just unpack this. I don't know how they get the fact that they were both naked. I guess maybe when he sees them by his garments, they're saying, you know, that she tore his garment off and she was already naked. And I bet the guys will understand this. I would be absolutely stunned if the women understand this. There is a technique that some of us were taught to use about imagining baseball players. Okay, if any of the guys know what I'm talking about, raise your hand. Oh, Jerry knows too. So the question is, what is it that will either prolong the experience or basically interrupt the experience? So Joseph is naked in bed with Mrs. Potiphar, and then the image of his father appears, who says, you're destined for greatness. With you and your brothers will be heads of tribes. The high priest will have an ephod, a breastplate with the names of the 12 tribes on them. And so that is your destiny. Do you want that, or do you want to be basically hanging out with loose women like Mrs. Potiphar and be a shepherd of prostitutes? And sure enough, there is this phrase in Proverbs about the phrase that Joanne just read. Okay, so let's continue. Like
Like
the
the
ghost.
ghost of like the ghost of Hamlet's father, whose visitation is but to whet his almost blunted purpose, Jacob's face hovers in the window, perhaps as a reflection of Joseph's own idealized self. The patriarch threatens him with the loss of wealth if he were to succumb and become a shepherd of prostitutes, Proverb 29:3. In turn, the father offers him a reward to be etched on the stones of the priestly breastplate along with his brothers. This is the rock of Israel, the promised wealth alluded to in Jacob's blessing to Joseph at the end of his life.
Yeah, I'm not going to go through the blessing, but at the end of Genesis, you have Jacob who is on his deathbed blessing his sons and sort of giving predictions about their future. And some of the verses here are going to look at that and go take them as a starting point for Midrash. Les.
Is there anywhere in the story of Joseph that he wanted to be with Potiphar's wife? I mean, or is this something? Because I didn't think
No, no,
he.
no, no.
Yeah,
You're absolutely right. There is nothing
right.
in the. Hold on, slow down.
Yeah.
That's what Midrash is all about. So what Midrash does, and I know, of us, Irwin is a great student of Midrash and often brings up interesting Midrashim. What Midrash does is pick up an element in the story which doesn't which sticks out, and then tries to explain it. So the element in the story here that doesn't seem to fit is, why is this house empty? And so one explanation is that Joseph deliberately planned to be there on a day when the house was empty. And so it's exploring that theme. But if nothing else, our discussion of this material is a good exercise in understanding the nature of Midrash and how wild it can go. Depending on how much time we have at the end, there's also this question of Joseph marrying a non-Jew, the daughter of an Egyptian priest, and and his sons. He has two sons, and they are heads of tribes. So how is it that they are Jewish if he's marrying a woman and having babies with her? But that's the role. And of course, the Midrash is going to say, of course, she converted, even though there's no reference to conversion in the Hebrew Bible. Mrs. Potiphar, not Mrs. Potiphar, Osnath, Joseph's wife, converted. Alan.
When you referred to Jacob's blessings at the end of his life, is those the verses where I recall Jacob says some pretty unkind things about his children?
Yeah, because his children have done some pretty unkind things to him.
Yeah, it never felt like a blessing, though.
Well, that's So that's actually, maybe that's not the perfect word.
No, it's
in
the
some
word
ways,
used. It is the word that used, but my recollection didn't feel like blessings. Yeah, right.
In some ways, it's a prediction of what what the sons will turn out to be. Skona.
Hey, Rabbi.
Hold on a second. Hold on. Erwin first, Skona, and then Erwin. Go ahead.
One of the other brothers had sex with what he thought was a prostitute, Tamar. His face didn't appear to him. He didn't get removed from the breastplate.
Oh, that's a very good point. No, and it's not only didn't he get removed. We're actually studying the Tamar stories on Wednesday. The brother was Judah, and that's why we're Jews, and the Messiah comes from Judah's line. So that's actually a great point. The good thing that we can say about Judah is he fesses up and admits he was in the wrong, and that Tamar was in the right. So I guess you could call that the power of confessing to your sin. But yes, it is a very good point. Excellent point. Erwin, you were going to say something.
Yeah,
Alan, you saw your hand up.
I always wondered that why did Jacob made the same mistake twice? We know the first one was a collaboration between the mother and son, and the second was Joseph. But it bothers me that the Torah goes along with two major mistakes.
So that is a great larger question. So let's face up to it. I often say Genesis is a wonderful guide to parenting. Whatever you read in Genesis, don't do. Jacob, you could argue, is the worst parent you almost could conceive. He has 12 sons and one daughter that we don't hear much about, but actually the story with the daughter is as bad as everything else. He favors two of the sons, Joseph and Benjamin, and clearly the other brothers feel resented. Other brothers, do terrible things, and so Jacob cheats his own brother Esau out of the parental blessing, and he has a terrible life. I mean, he thinks Joseph is dead, and Joseph never tells him, "Hi, Pop, I'm alive." Doesn't send him an email or camelgram or whatever. And so here's the question for you all. How do you feel about that? Does it bother you, or do you appreciate the fact that our sacred patriarchs are all too human, including David, who, arguably is the hero of the Bible, he commits adultery, murder, um, just to name two. So I'm curious about what you think about this. Clearly this bothers Irwin to some degree. I guess my own feeling is I love the fact that the Bible is presenting these people as real people. And in fact, I think it speaks to the likelihood that these stories have truth behind them. I'm not saying I take them literally, but if you were making up stories about your founders, you wouldn't make up such terrible stories, right? So I'm just curious if anybody has a reaction.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
Jacob was not punished, but David was punished because he was not allowed to build a temple.
Well, David was
And
punished because his household falls apart, and he does not build the temple. Solomon builds the temple. That's
yes,
true.
exactly.
That's true.
So,
Moses is
but
punished for losing
Jacob through his life with all his shenanigans, God really never punishes him
Well, I mean that
except when they fighting, his hip bone was removed, and that
well
was the
he
only.
strains his hip, and this was 4,000 years before hip replacements. So yeah, but he also, I mean, he has to flee. He's afraid of Esau. He lives with the idea that his son Joseph, his beloved son Joseph, is dead. I think some of his sons sleep with his concubine. I'm a little fuzzy on the details here. Jacob suffers a lot throughout his life, and at the end of his life, when he meets Pharaoh, he said, "My years, or whatever the number is, long and bitter." He's not a happy guy. So I would say he does suffer. But but anyway, but I'm curious. I'll call in Henry. Go ahead.
I appreciate the flaws. I think we can learn a lot from people and how they deal with their with their mistakes and move forward and so on and try to and then we can learn lessons from that from their
Okay.
flaws.
Okay.
Yeah, but Henry, it's a different kind when you only hurt your own family all the time. I mean, he was not a good example to be a father.
You're talking about Jacob.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I agree with
but
you. It is a serious character flaw.
yeah, it's interesting though because you even so you still get the 12 tribes. I mean, they all stuck together. It's not like Esau where he goes off wherever. They all kind of stayed together
Right. But
and
remember,
work
two of
things out as a
Joseph's
group.
brothers
I mean, so
I'll just point out that Joseph's brothers basically conspired to murder him. And
that's
only at the
true.
last minute did they just leave him in a pit and then sell him into slavery. This is not a happy family.
Right.
I've conducted a lot of
This is true.
funerals, and not everybody's been happy, but I've never heard of anybody selling their brother into slavery.
True.
Um,
True.
and then the brothers go back to Jacob and tell him that your son's been killed by a wild animal. And I can't remember the number of years, but I think it's the order of, I don't know, 10, 20 years before Jacob finds out that Joseph is in fact alive. Les.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing that they're so flawed because, when you live your life and you make mistakes and you do things you regret, and you look at our heroes of our Bible, and God kind of honored them, I guess you would say. And so it makes me feel better that at least I had a shot. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And it's we're all flawed, but if he's going to forgive these people for doing what they did, maybe we'll be forgiven also.
Yep. Jim.
Well, two things. I had a question because I'd never thought of the fact that Joseph could have very easily sent a message to his dad saying, "I'm alive."
Yes.
So my question is, why didn't he do that? But also, you just said that they told him that he was eaten by wild animals, and I don't think that's true.
that he was. They showed him his. Go
They
They
ahead.
showed him the thing covered with blood and said, "Is this the garment you gave him?" And he left it to his own. They left it to his own devices to surmise that it was animals. Kind of a legal.
Yeah, actually, it's a great point. I haven't looked at it in detail, but it's worth taking a closer look. But clearly, the intent of the story is Joseph's not coming home. He doesn't come home with a big wound in his leg. He's gone, and here's his bloody coat. Dad, you figure out what happened. And you're right. Joseph, although he is, works at the Potiphar house, is imprisoned, and then is basically made prime minister by the Pharaoh, and he interprets Pharaoh's dream, saying seven good years, and then 7 bad years. And the next time we sort of get back into the story, it's in the midst of the 7 bad years. So we're talking about certainly many years, and at least 7 good years when Joseph has been prime minister of Egypt, and certainly could have sent word home because they were traveling back and forth all the time. Joseph also tortures his brothers, when they come to beg for food. He plants the cup in Benjamin's sack. I mean, it's one big happy family. So it's it's an interesting family story. Alan.
So all of a sudden, what you're discussing about what we're looking at the dysfunctional individuals in the book of Genesis, right? And I came to appreciate
Certainly dysfunctional family dynamics. I'll leave to Cheryl to diagnose it and determine whether psychotropic medication.
Yeah, it's a term I've attached to those words over the years that I've been studying Genesis, and I appreciate that. What I believe we're trying to do is to see the qualities in humans that are not all good, are not all perfect. But what I just did to myself, which I'll have to work on, was the class you had about honoring your mother and father, because that is a subject that's complicated for me, and it kind of makes it closer to home, so to speak, because not to say that my family was dysfunctional, but I'd say my family was pretty dysfunctional.
Okay. Yeah, and actually we did a couple of sessions.
Yeah.
I don't remember if it was a Monday or a Wednesday on what does that commandment mean.
Yeah, honoring your parents, the commandment. No, I'm tying the discussion to the honoring your parents, because that felt like it was relevant.
Clearly, Joseph is not doing a great job with that. Henry.
Yeah, I had heard that perhaps one of the reasons why Joseph didn't try to get a hold of his dad, Jacob, was the fact that the last thing he had was his dad told him to go check on the brothers. And so he goes and checks on the brothers, and he ends up in a pit. So he's thinking, hey, was Pop in on this? So
that's interesting.
Never thought of that.
Yeah, that's kind of the thing I had heard.
Okay, there's a Midrash. There's a Midrash.
Yes.
I don't know if that's the Midrash of Henry's or whether that
No, I'd heard it. No, I didn't make it up. I heard it. So.
Rabbi,
you see where it comes from. You get the idea.
Yes. Yeah. Jacob tells him, Joseph, go check and see how your brothers are doing. I mean, that doesn't sound alarming, but anyway, I think that's a reasonable basis for a Midrash. Erwin?
Rabbi?
Yeah. Yes, Erwin.
I would like to tell you my Midrash, and I think the brothers were very unhappy with Joseph because he was always well groomed and took care of himself. And I think the brothers suggested to Jacob that Joseph is gay, and that's why they dumped him in the well to die, because he was a very feminine guy, and the brothers didn't like him. And in Genesis in Genesis, I think 39, something like that, 39 something. They point the Torah points also that he was well groomed, and the coat, the seven color coat, was a representation of feminine clothing.
Yes. So I would say this is definitely Midrash. It's definitely not in the Torah. The thing that
That's
we
my
know,
Midrash.
that's your Midrash. I think I've seen similar Midrashim.
Yeah.
It is clear in the Torah that Joseph is Jacob's favorite. And remember, Jacob wanted to marry Rachel. And then at the wedding, Rachel's sister Leah is switched.
Yeah.
She was under the veil. And he has to work another 7 years to marry Rachel. And then he has children by Leah, Rachel, and their two handmaids. But clearly Rachel was his favorite, and Rachel dies. I don't remember if she dies in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. I just don't remember.
Benjamin.
There is some speculation. Even there's even a line in the lyrics of the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat that Joseph reminded Jacob of Rachel. So the idea that he may have had feminine aspects or feminine visage, I will say, is very plausible. And there's also text, we read about it, that he was very good looking. He was handsome and very good looking. And one could argue that could be a feminist, that there could have been a feminine characteristic to his looks. The only issue with his grooming is he gets this really nice coat from his father.
And Rabbi, also, I know this for a fact. A very good friend of mine, he was a Turkish guy, and his father was a physician in the Sultan's harem. And
Right.
according to him, the eunuch was there was a guy who was guarding the women there,
Right.
and no actual male could go into the harem.
Right.
And so maybe Potiphar's husband thought that Joseph is no danger to the women because he's gay.
That's very interesting. Never heard that one. I like that. And you remember in the book of Esther, there are eunuchs that are guarding the harem when they try out, when they have their tryouts to be queen. And there, the word for eunuch is saris, and it's the same as the word that is used to describe Potiphar's position. Skona.
To blame Joseph for not getting in touch with Jacob, he would have to know that Jacob thinks he's dead. He wouldn't have any reason to know that.
Well, I mean, that's a point, but his brothers threw him in a pit.
That's true.
And then sold him into slavery. So at best, he would reason that his father thinks he's been sold into slavery,
right?
And now he's prime minister of Egypt. You would think that he would say, "Hey, Pop, I made it good here." But that's a very good point, Alan.
Could there be on this subject a concern on Joseph's blowing his cover in the way in which I don't remember if he was known as being an Israelite.
Yeah, he's known as being a Hebrew.
A Hebrew.
Yeah, the baker and the wine, butler. I think actually say there's a Hebrew in prison who's really good with dreams.
Well, the Pharaoh knows that and accepts him in this key role. So blowing his cover probably isn't one of his concerns by contacting his father.
Blowing his cover with the Egyptians.
With his he adopted himself to this community. He married an Egyptian and da 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 da. So this contacting him would kind of, I was using the expression, blow his cover.
Yeah, so. I think it is known in the Genesis story. I think it's known to Pharaoh that he was an Egyptian. He was a Hebrew prisoner. And in archaeology, there's evidence that Egypt was ruled by Semitic leaders over a period of time, and that also lends some credibility to this story as being historically um, uh, plausible.
Would they be descendants of the slaves that didn't go with the Exodus?
I don't understand what you just said.
Oh, so when you said Semitic, I was equating it to Hebrews or Israelites, which is to say, not everybody left in the Exodus. And when you said
Oh no, so presumably the story, because you see Semitic names in Egyptian records of a ruling tribe, and there's even a tribe called the Habirus, which people speculate may have been the Hebrews. And so I think it's often interpreted as as an Egyptian source for the fact that Hebrews were in charge of Egypt at some point, but presumably they left less.
Maybe we can put a happy face on Joseph and say maybe he realized that he had been such a jerk with his brothers, and he thought that if I go back and see my father, then I'll have to explain to him what my brothers did. So maybe he's trying to save his brother's face, brother's
Yeah,
face.
so that's a great point. And of course, at the end, after his father dies, his brothers are afraid that Joseph is going to basically take it out on them. And he certainly has the ability because he's prime minister of Egypt. And he makes this wonderful speech, which basically makes the point, you brothers thought you were doing wrong to me, but really you were just God's instrument of putting me here where I managed to save the grain and feed Egypt and that part of the world. So your point actually turns out to be exactly what the Torah says.
Oh,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay, good. Let's continue, like the ghost of Hamlet's father.
Well, I think we're at what paradoxically interprets.
Okay, we're down to one. Okay.
Yeah. What paradoxically interprets the sektak is the stone image of the father's features and the reward of having his name engraved on one of the 12 stones of the epod. This cools Joseph's ardor and it softens the phallus so that it returns to its former natural state, his
What?
vigor etano.
Okay. So it interrupts the sex act. Yeah. So according to this Midrash, Joseph is ready to go at it, and then he sees the image of his father saying, "Do you want to be remembered as the guy who hustles prostitutes?" Hard to imagine that a leader might ever be in such a position to be remembered as such. But his father says, "You want to be the guy who is remembered by someone who hangs out with prostitutes and loose women, or do you want to join your brothers on the high priest's ephod?" And that turns out to cool his ardor. So let's read what the Talmud says about that.
At once his bow remained taut, Vatashev bi etan kasto. Rabbi Yochanan, in the name of Rabbi Meir, said this teaches that his bow returned to its natural state, Shava Kasha La Etanu, and his arms were made firm. Ibid B24, he thrust 10 fingers into the ground, and his seed was excreted from between his fingernails. It is not
There's
firmness.
nothing I can add to this. Joseph basically ejaculates through his fingernails. Any questions about that? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's going pretty far-fetched. Okay.
It is not firmness in body, but a resoluteness of mind, loyalty to the image of his father that preserves Joseph's integrity. Implicit in the narrative is the substitution of Jacob for Potiphar's wife as the object of Joseph's focus. As Levison points out, given the projection of the other as woman, Potiphar's wife, uncontrolled passion, and its attendant loss of cultural identity is counterbalanced by Jacob's offer of a spiritual fraternity. This is a fealty to a socially
Thus it is.
Thus it is fealty to a socially sanctioned homosocial community, allied with father and brothers, all male, that displaces the power of the seductive foreign female.
Okay, good guy, Joseph.
Joseph's spiritual descent in Egypt. In the biblical text, when he refrains from sexual relations with Potiphar's wife, Joseph does not return to his natural state in alliance with his father and brothers. Rather, the converse happens. Joseph attempts to assimilate in Egypt and marries Asnath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. He also gives his first child a name that signifies alienation from his paternal home.
Let's just read that little phrase.
Joseph named the firstborn Manasseh, for God has made
Menashe, sorry.
Manasseh, for God has made me forget Nashami, all my hardship and all my father's house.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is conflating a lot of story, but basically, after this episode with Potiphar's wife, I mean, he's thrown into jail for quite some time. I can't remember the amount of time. But then when he makes good, he doesn't try to recapture his origins as a Hebrew, and return to his, to his land. And, presumably he could have said to Pharaoh, after I serve you and, and manage, the new Egyptian Department of Economic Efficiency for 14 years. And after I do that job really, really well, I want to return to my land and, to my brothers and to my father. He doesn't say that. He actually is very happy to assimilate in Egypt, marrying the daughter of an Egyptian priest, and even names his child, a name which highlights the fact that God now has allowed him to forget basically his origins, his father's house. Yeah, Jim.
Well, who in their right mind in Joseph's case would want to go back to his brothers and Jacob when he's got all this in Egypt? I mean, I would have stayed also.
Yep, I don't disagree with that. Presumably, he could have decided. Here's an idea. It's a crazy, far-fetched idea that no rational leader would ever embrace. But he could have said, you know what? We should buy Canaan and make it part of Egypt. Crazy idea, Who would ever think of such an outrageous thing?
You are no longer allowed to watch, Rabbi, you're no longer allowed to watch the news.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, it was mega. It was make Egypt great again. That's with Joseph's role. Yeah, but he could have. I mean, your point is very well taken. Joseph probably had no great love loss, and actually thank God for helping him to forget his horrible experience in Canaan and with his brothers. Yeah, Alan, go ahead.
Seriously, though, can we get the idea, and when we get through going through Exodus, we're trying to appreciate the creation of a community and family in different parshayot, kind of highlight that. And so I'm trying to respond to the sort of the question of why would Joseph wanted to go back?
Mm-hmm.
Because he has this, even in spite of the rough time he had with his brothers and his father, it's family.
Yes. So that is a very important point. And what I would say is, I think I talk about this a lot. I've conducted about 600 funerals or so. And I would say it is very common for siblings, brothers and sisters, to not get along well at this point in their life. Mom or dad is dying, the children are adults. And, there are times when, I run into a very loving family who have worked together to do all this. But I can tell you there are times when the brothers and sisters are at each other's throats. They vehemently disagree about many, many things. And they're not pleasant about it. And, for me, one of the most horrific was a funeral I think I did in Camarillo for a man who lived in Camarillo, who was so estranged from his children that he had grandchildren that were like 12, 13 years old living in the valley. So we're talking about a 20 to 30-minute drive that he had never met because he was so estranged from the family. So I would say it's not all that uncommon. Let's finish the article and then we can discuss a little bit. I don't think we're going to entertain restarting another article. Joanne?
Over the course of the more than 20 years that Joseph resides in Egypt while his father grieves, Joseph never sends word home, not even when lifted out of prison and elevated to viceroy. The image of the father in reality is held aloof and fading. Only after he rises from the second pit prison in Egypt and sees his brothers face to face, when ensconced behind his Egyptian mask, can Joseph begin to make the slow journey homeward.
Yeah, so it's 20 years. Yeah, I didn't remember, but I'm going to stop sharing so we can see each other a little more easily. Yeah, so it's Joseph clearly never sends word home. He meets the brothers several times when they're basically begging for food. And it's only when he sees his younger brother Benjamin, presumably that he really loved, his full brother Benjamin, that he weeps and identifies himself to his brothers. And the first question he asks is, "Does my father yet live? Is my father still alive?" So it's quite a story. So to me, the contrast, and I'll ask Jim as our Catholic expert here, is that by and large, Jesus, and I think also to some degree Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, are viewed as being without flaw or without serious flaws. I think I'm more confident about this with the Jesus story than I am about the prophet Muhammad. And so there's an alternative way of looking at it, that you have a perfect leader who, of course, in Christianity is not only a leader or patriarch, but also God in some sense. But there's a contrast: someone who's perfect uh, versus these stories in Genesis, where people are far from perfect, and also the King David story is a tremendous story of a king that is very realistic and far from perfection. I'm going to give Jim a chance to respond if you would like to, and then I'll call on Alan.
Well, there are no perfect people in the Hebrew Bible, but there is in the New Testament. Jesus is often called the Lamb of God, and so being the sacrificial lamb, he had to be perfect.
Yes. So that's a very good point, because in biblical Hebrew, when you sacrifice animals at the temple, they have to be without serious flaw. I mean, you're not going to have anything that's perfect, but there are many flaws which would make a sacrifice ineligible. And I often think of, in terms of the story of Jesus' sacrifice, in a way, it's very biblical Jewish. You have the greatest sin in the world, original sin. So you need the best possible sacrifice, God become human to be sacrificed. I mean, this makes logical sense to me. I don't believe the story. Otherwise, I would have been at that conference with a fun collar on instead of my yarmulke on. But anyway, it makes sense to me. Alan.
I was thinking about how Joseph was thinking and behaving, and I want to sort of make you an opportunity, because you just said that you were in this Catholic conference where the subject was compassion. So I'm thinking that Joseph demonstrated compassion in the way he treated when his brothers showed up. And I don't know if that's an example or whether you gave examples that would include Joseph in your class.
Yeah. So what I would say is Joseph's compassion, it is there at the very end. I mean, Joseph goes through many years where he is the viceroy or prime minister of Egypt, never lets his family know. Even when he finds out that there's famine in Canaan, We don't see any evidence that he, I think there was an Egyptian Agency for International Development, but it doesn't seem to have done very much in terms of helping neighboring nations. And even when Joseph's brothers show up begging for food, he tortures them. Basically, he gets even with them. He's saying, you're spies. I'm going to keep, I can't remember, one or two of you until you bring back Benjamin. So finally, he absolutely helps them. And then I would say, in a very magnanimous act at the end of his life, or really after his father dies, I should say, he says, he says to his brothers, don't be so hard on yourself. You were just God's tool to help the world by putting me in a position where I could actually help the world. Even though you thought you were selling me into slavery, God knew that you were really putting me in a position where I could do a lot of good. So in that way, I absolutely agree with you. But it took him a while to get around to it. I actually found another interesting article. I thought we would get through this a lot quicker than we did, but it's an interesting article on the subject of the Jewishness of Joseph's children, because I mean, most of us, know about traditional Judaism, that if you have a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother, the children are not Jewish. And the reverse is true. If you have a Jewish mother and a non-Jewish father, the children are fully and wholly Jewish. But of course, the great counterexample to this is Joseph, because clearly he marries the daughter of an Egyptian priest. In the Bible, there is no mention of her converting. And so that's a clear example that in biblical times, your tribe went with your father. And I found kind of an interesting article which talks about, of course, the Midrash that Osnath converts, and then also another explanation that simply that wasn't the practice in biblical times. It becomes the practice in rabbinic times. So we will indeed meet next Monday. Then actually, Sonia and I are off to Mexico for a little while. I think we're just going to miss one Monday class. So with all of that, I will invite any other comments, but thank you. I hope you're enjoying the world of Midrash and how wild it can be.
You're going to send out the dates that you're not going to be here, right?
Yeah, I always do that, but we're definitely here a week from Monday. What
about Wednesday? Are we going to be here 2 nights from now?
We are here. We will be here Monday, March 3rd, but not here Wednesday the 5th. And
what about this?
Won't have any classes the following week, the 10th through the 10th or the 12th. But I will send that out.
Continuing this subject, Joseph, on March 3rd?
Yeah, I think on March 3rd, I think I'm going to read the other article.
Great.
It's a nice article. It's called Joseph and Asnath, a question of conversion. So, and it's actually from the Jerusalem Post, which is not a source I usually find. So anyway, yeah, so we will do that one.
Rabbi, are we having a class in 2 nights? Because you didn't talk about this coming Wednesday. Is there a class?
Yes, there is a class this coming Wednesday.
Okay, thank you.
And I think we're continuing with the Tamar stories. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so take care, everyone, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, guys. Have a great evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.